She wasn't supposed to touch him. She wasn't cleared. She wasn't authorized. But when a critically injured man was wheeled into the ER, Nurse Aaliyah Carter made a choice: save his life or watch him die in silence. What she didn't know was that the stranger she fought for was the president's only son. Within 24 hours, she went from being fired without warning to being summoned to the White House. But this isn't just a story about redemption. It's about one woman's courage to challenge a broken system and lead a revolution from the inside out. This is not about breaking rules. It's about rewriting them. You're watching Flow Story, and this is She Got Fired for Saving a Life. One stas, walapsai. 24 hours later, the White House called. It was just past midnight when the rain began to pound Atlanta like a war drum, hammering against the emergency room's broad windows, with an unrelenting rhythm that matched Aaliyah Carter's growing unease. The lights in Riverside Memorial flickered once as thunder cracked over the Georgia sky, but inside the ER, the fluorescent glow remained constant, cold, and clinical. Aaliyah, 28, stood near the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts, her curls pinned back beneath a navy scrub cap, dark circles shadowing her almond eyes from the past 3 back-to-back night shifts. She was known around the hospital as the calm in the storm, the one who never flinched, never complained, the one who stayed late when others clocked out early. She hadn't had dinner, barely sipped her coffee, but when the call came through, the kind of page that carried silence in its wake, her spine straightened instinctively. Unidentified male incoming, massive thoracic trauma, unconscious. ETA, 90 seconds. That was all the radio crackled. 90 seconds. That was all she had. The ER had been chaotic earlier, 2 back-to-back shooting victims and a child with sepsis. But now, in this small window of stillness, it felt like everything had drawn its breath. Until it came. The ambulance doors burst open as if flung by a hurricane. Rain swept into the corridor, followed by 2 paramedics drenched and pale. Their stretcher bore a young man, limbs limp, uniform shredded, face a swollen, unrecognizable mask of blood and bruises. "Code Red!" one paramedic barked. Early 30s, no ID, found near the freight docks, possible blast wounds, chest trauma, vitals tanking. Aaliyah's eyes locked on the glint of metal around his neck, barely visible beneath torn fabric and congealed blood. A dog tag, bent and smeared with grime. Her fingers instinctively brushed it aside. T. Walker, U.S. Marine. Her heart stumbled. "Is he military?" someone whispered. "No phone, no ID, just dumped there," the paramedic confirmed. "Could be federal, could be classified." That's when it happened. Everything paused. The attending physician, Dr. Hopkins, a man more politician than practitioner, hesitated. "We don't have clearance. We wait for authorization," he said. Another nurse nodded stiffly. What if he's under protection? What if treating him compromises a federal op? Aaliyah couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man was dying, his pulse thready, lips ghost gray, each breath a weaker gasp. "He'll be dead in 10 minutes, she said firmly, her voice slicing the hesitation like a scalpel. "You don't touch him," the attending snapped. "We'll be liable." She took a single step forward, then another. "I need Trauma Bay 2 prepped. Get a suture kit, O-neg plasma, and a crash cart now." "Nurse Carter, stand down," Hopkins barked, but she was already peeling off her lab coat, snapping on gloves, eyes locked on the Marine's crumpled chest, rising ever more slowly. The room froze. Tension electrified the air. Then a resident, a young Latino intern, moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Just like that, the team followed her. Wheels screeched across linoleum as they rushed the man into Trauma Bay 2. Inside, under flickering surgical lights, the chaos erupted. Gauze, suction, IV lines, blood pressure cuff, O2 mask. The heart monitor wailed inconsistently. BP 70/30, pulse ox at 79. "Get me a thoracotomy tray," Aaliyah ordered, already slicing through the Marine's tattered shirt. Blood gushed from a deep gash under his ribcage. "Lung collapse," she muttered. "He's bleeding out internally." Hands slick, breath steady, she worked with the precision of someone who'd seen too many young men die. Scalpel, clamp, suction, the rhythm of trauma. She didn't hesitate. didn't blink when she pulled the first jagged piece of shrapnel from his chest. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're not dying here." Blood pooled on the floor. Her knees ached from the strain. Her back screamed. But she kept going, one shard, then another, each one a battle. Then, flatline. The monitor screamed a long, unbroken wail. "He's coding!" someone shouted. "Charging to 200!" Aaliyah grabbed the paddles. "Clear!" His body jerked. Nothing. "Charging to 250! Again!" The second shock rippled through him. And then, a beep. One small, stubborn beep. "He's back!" the tech whispered. Her knees buckled slightly, but she didn't stop. She inserted the chest tube, drained the blood, patched the torn lung, and closed the muscle. It took 3.5 hours. When it was done, the trauma bay was silent. Blood bags hung empty. Tools scattered across steel trays. Aaliyah peeled off her gloves, hands trembling, eyes locked on the Marine's still form. And then, he stirred, eyelids fluttering, lips moving. She leaned in. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible. A tear traced her cheek. She hadn't cried in years. Not when her father died, not when her mother left, not during any of the long, thankless nights. But now, just a whisper, "Thank you." And she almost collapsed. He was alive. Against protocol, against odds, he was alive. But even then, as the sun began to rise over Atlanta's skyline and golden light spilled through the stained hospital windows, Aaliyah knew the cost would come. Protocols, paperwork, punishment. She had disobeyed a direct order. She had taken a risk for a man she didn't know. And yet, watching the steady rhythm of his breathing, the calm rise and fall of his chest, she felt no regret. Only quiet triumph. Only peace. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. All she knew was that he mattered, and that had been enough. What she didn't know, what no one in that hospital knew, was that she had just saved the son of the President of the United States. The morning after that stormy, blood-soaked night arrived with a deceptive calmness that wrapped the city in golden light and gentle warmth. But inside Aaliyah Carter's chest, there was a quiet storm brewing, tension coiled like a spring, waiting to snap. She had barely slept. Her uniform still carried the scent of adrenaline and antiseptic, her hands still stained faintly pink despite 3 scrubbings. The memory of that man, the Marine, his broken body, his soft "thank you," looped endlessly in her mind like a sacred mantra. She sat alone in the tiny hospital break room, sipping bitter coffee from a styrofoam cup, staring blankly through the smudged window toward the city skyline, unaware that around her, the whispers had already begun. Her colleagues passed by the hallway, hushed voices lowering as they glanced through the open door. Some nodded at her without meeting her eyes. Others walked faster. Aaliyah wasn't naive. She could feel the silence pressing in, heavy and sharp. At 9:06 a.m., her name crackled through the hospital intercom. "Nurse Aaliyah Carter, report to the administrative office immediately." The words weren't unusual, but the tone was. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. She stood, exhaled slowly, and walked through the sterile halls she had paced for 4 long years. Past the supply closet where she once helped save a newborn. Past the pediatric bay where a little girl had drawn her a picture just a week ago. Those walls had held her dreams, her exhaustion, her hope. But this morning, they felt foreign. As she stepped into the administrative wing, the air seemed colder, the lighting dimmer. The door to Director Chambers' office was already open. Inside sat 3 people. Director Lila Chambers, stiff in a charcoal suit. Mr. Nathan Weathers, the hospital's legal advisor, glasses glinting with quiet authority. And Dr. Hopkins, arms folded, mouth set in a thin line. "Please sit," Chambers said, her voice clipped. Aaliyah did slowly, her back straight, eyes steady. She had saved a life. She had done what was right. But the moment Chambers spoke, she realized that truth alone wouldn't protect her. "Your actions last night," Chambers began, "while emotionally commendable, were a direct violation of federal medical protocol." Aaliyah blinked. "He was dying. There was no time—" "There are channels, Nurse Carter," Weathers interrupted smoothly. "You circumvented chain of command. You treated an unidentified military operative without clearance, placing this institution at serious legal risk. So, I should have let him die, she snapped before she could stop herself. Hopkins leaned forward. It wasn't your decision to make. A moment of silence followed, so thick it choked her. And then came the words, final, inevitable, brutal. You are hereby terminated from Riverside Memorial, effective immediately. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. Terminated. As if her sacrifice, her training, her instincts, her entire being meant nothing. Her lips parted. I saved him. And we appreciate that, Weathers said blandly, already closing the folder in front of him. But the liability, she repeated, bitter heat rising in her throat. Not the human life, just paperwork. No one responded. She rose, slowly, dignity intact, heart in pieces. She walked out without another word, her footsteps echoing louder than they ever had in that silent hallway. At her locker, she emptied her things, her stethoscope, her worn notebook filled with patient notes, the photo of her and her little brother taken on her graduation day, and placed them gently in her canvas tote. She unclipped her name tag last, staring at the plastic rectangle as if it belonged to someone else now. Around her, the ER moved on. A few nurses offered quiet glances. One, Maria, whispered, I'm sorry. Aaliyah smiled faintly, nodded, then stepped out into the thick, unmoving heat of an Atlanta morning. The hospital loomed behind her like a place she had never belonged. All I did was save someone, she murmured, but the world didn't always reward the right thing. That afternoon was a blur, long hours curled on the faded couch in her one-bedroom apartment, dog tag clenched in her palm, news off, phone ignored. She barely moved, save for the rise and fall of her chest. She had always thought that when something huge happened, the world would feel different, louder, brighter, sharper. But everything felt the same, ordinary, until the knock. It came at precisely 8:14 a.m. the next morning, firm, deliberate, unrelenting, not the hesitant knock of a neighbor, nor the lazy thud of a delivery. Aaliyah frowned, wrapping her robe tighter around her as she approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw black, suits, ties, sunglasses. 3 men, silent and still as statues. Her stomach dropped. She cracked the door an inch. Ms. Aaliyah Carter? The man in the center asked. His voice was smooth, calm, rehearsed. Yes, she answered cautiously. Agent Reese, United States Secret Service. We're here to escort you to Washington, D.C. The president would like to speak with you. For a moment, Aaliyah forgot how to blink. The president of the United States? Yes, ma'am, immediately. Why? I'm not at liberty to say, but it's urgent. You'll have time to dress en route. She almost laughed. I'm not even employed. You are now, he said without inflection. The rest was a blur. She changed in under 3 minutes, jeans, a plain blouse, her hair pulled into a quick bun. She shoved the dog tag into her pocket out of instinct, locked the door, and stepped into the black SUV with tinted windows and leather seats that smelled like command. Her neighbors watched behind parted blinds. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. Her heart was pounding too loudly. The convoy drove in silence. No sirens, no lights. Just unspoken authority carving through traffic. As they crossed the state line and merged onto the interstate, Aaliyah stared out at the rolling trees, trying to steady her breath. What did I do? She whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Agent Reese replied without turning his head. You saved someone. I didn't know who he was, she said. That's precisely why it matters, he said. Hours later, as the convoy passed through the final security gates of a secluded federal estate just outside D.C., Aaliyah's hands began to tremble. The house before her was stately and elegant, flanked by fountains and flags. Staffers greeted her with quiet urgency. Doors opened before her as if rehearsed. She was led down a hall so grand she felt like an imposter. And then the final doors parted. And there he stood, the president. Older than she expected, leaner too, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and a burden few could understand. He turned to face her fully, hands clasped behind his back. Ms. Carter, he said, voice deep and steady. Thank you for coming. Aaliyah's mouth was dry. Yes, sir. Please, he gestured to the seat across from him. She sat, slowly. He remained standing. "You saved my son's life." The air stopped. Aaliyah stared. The weight of the moment crashed into her like a tidal wave. I didn't know." "Exactly," he said softly. "That's what makes it extraordinary." He stepped forward. "When policy paused, you acted. When others feared repercussions, you feared for a man's life. And because of that, he's alive." He paused, then smiled faintly. "And so are we." She had no words, just the echo of the trauma bay, just the memory of blood and desperation, and a single whisper. "Thank you." But the president wasn't finished. He reached for a small folder placed neatly on the desk. "We've brought you here today, not just to thank you," he said, "but to honor you." He opened it. "Ms. Aaliyah Carter, by order of the President of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Medal of Honor." Her breath hitched, her vision blurred. She didn't speak. Couldn't. "And that's not all," he added, smiling. "We'd like to offer you a new position. As of today, you were appointed as head nurse of the White House Medical Unit." Her knees went weak. She gripped the arms of the chair to keep from collapsing. And in that moment, between disbelief and rebirth, Aaliyah Carter, once invisible, once discarded, once punished for her courage, was seen, truly seen. The daughter of a nurse who never had a voice, the girl who once studied under streetlights because the power had been shut off, the woman who chose humanity over rules, was now seated in the heart of a nation's gratitude. And yet, she had no idea that this was only the beginning. The moment the president placed the Medal of Honor around Aaliyah Carter's neck, a thunderstorm of camera shutters erupted inside the East Room of the White House, echoing like applause disguised as static, a rising tide of noise that matched the chaos of emotions pulsing through her veins. The cool weight of the medal rested against her chest like an anchor and a flame all at once, grounding her even as her soul threatened to lift into the ceiling from disbelief. She stood motionless, her breath caught somewhere between humility and shock, her fingers trembling slightly at her sides. The First Lady stood beside her, radiant and teary-eyed, gently touching Aaliyah's elbow as if trying to pass strength directly through skin. "You deserve this," she whispered, and Aaliyah's eyes flooded. For the first time since that brutal night in the ER, she let the tears fall, not from exhaustion or fear, but from the overwhelming realization that she was no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer the woman who had been fired in silence. The room swelled with warmth and respect, a rare and sacred kind of energy that transcended politics, race, or position. When the applause quieted, the president leaned toward the microphone once more and said, "One more thing," in that deep, composed tone that made the room still again. "This administration doesn't just believe in reward. We believe in responsibility. And we believe in people who lead with compassion and courage. So, today, I am officially appointing Aaliyah Carter as the new head nurse of the White House Medical Clinic." The press exploded. Aaliyah swayed, stunned. "Sir, I'm not even employed right now," she murmured, dazed. The First Lady chuckled gently, turning to her. "You are now," she said, and the crowd laughed with a kind of reverence, as if witnessing a fairy tale becoming real. A staffer stepped forward, presenting a polished document bearing the presidential seal, her official appointment. "Do you accept?" the president asked. Aaliyah swallowed, glancing down at the dog tag she still carried in her pocket, then up again. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Yes, I do." That night, her face was on every major news outlet. "From fire to the White House," read one headline. "The nurse who said yes when everyone else said wait." Social media erupted. As Aaliyah Carter trended globally within hours, and hashtags like "Jam from fired" to "Forever Jam a nurse hero" and "Jamis Weezy." Yo Aaliyah flooded timelines with tributes, artwork, and praise. But while praise poured from the outside world, inside Aaliyah's heart, a quieter storm brewed. The next day, she stood in front of the cream-colored two-story home she had been gifted, a beautiful colonial-style house in Arlington with green shutters and white columns, the kind of place she'd only seen on postcards. The president handed her a key in front of a cheering crowd, saying, "This isn't just a home, it's a beginning." Aaliyah smiled, held the key aloft, as reporters snapped thousands of photos and later gave a short, heartfelt speech that brought even hardened journalists to tears. "I didn't do what I did for recognition," she said into the mic. "I did what I was trained to do. I saw a man who needed help. I didn't know he was anyone's son. I only knew he was someone." The applause that followed was thunderous, but the tide, as always, shifted quietly first. In the days that followed, Aaliyah began her new role at the White House Medical Clinic, stepping into halls lined with oil portraits of presidents and polished marble floors. Her ID badge read, Aaliyah Carter, RN, Director of Medical Services. Her uniform bore the White House insignia. She oversaw briefings with Secret Service medics, prepared emergency protocols for visiting dignitaries, and even treated the vice president's wife for a minor allergic reaction on her third day. But while the prestige was real, so was the growing discomfort beyond those walls. On forums where hospital staff gathered anonymously, whispers turned into daggers. She got lucky. It was all staged. If that Marine hadn't been the president's son, no one would even know her name. One anonymous post on a nurse's subreddit read, "So I guess the rules don't matter anymore, as long as you cry in front of the president." Those words stung more than she admitted, because they didn't come from strangers. They came from people who had stood beside her during Code Blues, who had borrowed her pens and eaten from her packed lunches. The betrayal cut deeper than any media speculation. But she said nothing. She kept her head high, her work precise, her smile soft. She showed up early. She stayed late. She worked through pain. But when she returned home each night and looked at the dog tag sitting quietly on her desk, she was reminded that her silence had a purpose, that her humility had roots. Still, something gnawed at her, a hollow ache, not from ungratefulness, but from grief. Grief for the community she had lost, for the friendships now wrapped in suspicion, for the version of herself who had once felt at home in a chaotic ER. One night, after finishing a late shift briefing emergency evacuation drills with security, Aaliyah slipped into her car and drove without direction. The city lights blurred around her as her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Almost without realizing it, she found herself parked across from her old hospital in Atlanta. It looked the same, impersonal, stern, unbothered by her absence. She watched the glowing ambulance bay from across the street, watched staff move briskly, paramedics unloading stretchers, nurses wheeling carts. She zipped up her hoodie, pulled the hood low, and walked across. Inside, the scent hit her first, antiseptic, sweat, and tension. She blended into the crowd. No one noticed, no one stared. In one corner, a young nurse with trembling hands was struggling to insert an IV line while a panicked father hovered nearby. Her voice shook, her hands fumbled. Aaliyah stepped forward instinctively. "Slow down," she whispered. "Lift the port here. Breathe." The nurse turned, startled, eyes wide. Aaliyah smiled, guided the line gently, helped her lock it in place, then stepped back. The girl blinked at her, confused, about to speak, but Aaliyah was already gone. She exited the hospital like a ghost, her heart pounding, but not with fear, with clarity. She had been that girl once, overwhelmed, alone, quietly drowning in responsibility. And now she knew what she had to do. The very next morning, she called her attorney and her financial advisor. She created a foundation, privately, quietly, under a different name, with the sole mission of providing scholarships to nursing students from underprivileged backgrounds. No cameras, no press release, just letters. Letters she wrote herself. Letters that read, "We see you. Don't stop. The world needs nurses like you." And as the headlines faded, as the applause grew quieter, Aaliyah Carter stepped into something far greater than recognition. She stepped into legacy. The day dawned crisp and golden when the south lawn of the White House was transformed into something both ceremonial and deeply personal. A subtle breeze fluttering the flags as rows of white chairs were lined with precision under a clear sky painted in spring's softest blues. Staffers moved with quiet urgency, finalizing placements, checking clipboards, adjusting microphones. But Aaliyah Carter stood just to the side of the stage, hands folded calmly in front of her, her tailored navy dress brushing her knees, her ID badge glinting softly under the sun, a quiet figure with a heart that thundered against her ribs like it hadn't in weeks. Today wasn't about her, not publicly at least. It was the launch of the new White House Medical Mentorship Initiative, her brainchild, born out of long nights, lived experience, and a deep ache to offer young medical professionals what she herself had never had: guidance, protection, belonging. Dozens of new recruits sat eagerly in the front rows, dressed in crisp uniforms, their faces a blend of hope, nerves, and awe. Behind them were members of Congress, military brass, global press, and, unannounced to her until that morning, a very special guest. Aaliyah had just finished a quiet conversation with the Surgeon General when the soft murmur of the crowd shifted, like a ripple rolling through still water, and she turned. Her breath caught. Walking down the central aisle in full dress blues, medals pinned to his chest, posture impossibly straight despite what he had endured, was Lance Corporal Thomas Walker, the Marine whose life she had fought for in a rain-drenched trauma bay under flickering hospital lights and bureaucratic fear. He looked whole now, alive in a way he hadn't been when she last saw him, when he was drowning in blood and barely breathing. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time didn't just slow, it collapsed entirely. He stepped onto the stage, not heading for the podium, but directly toward her. The crowd stilled. Not a cough, not a whisper. The camera zoomed in, lenses clicking rapidly but respectfully. When he reached her, he stood at attention, eyes burning with something ancient and honorable, and then slowly, with the gravity of ceremony and the weight of debt, he raised his hand in salute. Aaliyah's mouth parted slightly, her eyes stinging. She'd been praised by presidents, awarded on national television, written about in newspapers across the globe, but this moment undid her. Because it wasn't politics, it wasn't optics, it was truth. She stood straighter, blinking fast, and though her hands trembled slightly, she returned the salute, not as a soldier, but as a healer, as someone who had stared down death and told it, "Not tonight." When their hands dropped, Thomas turned to the podium. He didn't read from notes, his voice low and steady carried across the lawn. "When I woke up in that hospital room," he said, "I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who had saved me. All I knew was that I was alive when I shouldn't have been." The crowd leaned in, hanging on every word. "Later, I found out most of my unit hadn't made it. We were ambushed. We had no backup, no exit. I should have died with them. And if I had, my family would have mourned quietly and privately. But instead, I woke up, and the first face I saw was hers." He turned slightly toward Aaliyah, and she lowered her gaze, humility pulsing through her like heat. "She didn't know who I was. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't ask for permission. She saw a man bleeding out and she fought for him. Not because I was the president's son, but because I was someone." A gasp rippled through a pocket of the crowd. Many hadn't known the full identity of the Marine. The truth landed like thunder. "And then," Thomas continued, "when she was punished for doing the right thing, when they tried to silence her, she didn't grow bitter. She didn't lash out. She rose higher. She made space for others. For people like me, for people like all of you," he said, turning to the recruits seated in the front rows. "You're learning from someone who doesn't just wear a title. You're learning from someone who risked everything for a stranger." The standing ovation was immediate, fierce, and deafening. Aaliyah stood frozen as Thomas stepped back and reached for her hand, not for show, not for photo ops, but as a friend, as a fellow survivor, as a man who owed her his second chance. She took it, and they stood there together under the bright sun, while the world clapped and some wiped tears from their eyes. Later that day, as the crowd dispersed and speeches gave way to soft music and light refreshments, Aaliyah found herself surrounded by recruits, young nurses, EMTs, med students, all eager to learn, some shy, some tearful. One young woman whispered, "I'm here because of you." Another said, "No one's ever believed in me before." Aaliyah smiled, hugged them, listened to their stories. But when the afternoon began to fade and the crowd thinned, she slipped away into the quieter corridors of the White House, away from the ceremony and into the beating heart of her work. She walked past the portrait gallery, past the polished mahogany doors, and into the medical clinic that now bore her name on the office wall. On her desk, untouched since the day she'd placed it there, still sat the dog tag, T. Walker, U.S. Marine. She reached for it now, fingers brushing the cold metal, and this time, she smiled. It no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. The circle was complete. She hadn't just saved a life, she had rewritten both their legacies. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning, because somewhere out there, more lives would hang in the balance, more nurses would be silenced, more systems would stall. And Aaliyah Carter, once fired for doing what was right, now stood at the epicenter of change, armed not just with credentials, but with purpose. In the weeks that followed the South Lawn ceremony, Aaliyah Carter's name surged through the veins of America's collective consciousness like wildfire. Her speech replayed across news stations, her salute with Lance Corporal Walker featured on magazine covers, her name spoken on morning talk shows, podcast interviews, and even late-night comedy sketches that affectionately called her the nurse who changed the nation. But as her public reverence blossomed, so too did the darker undercurrent of resentment that trailed behind it, like a shadow that refused to be outrun. At first it was subtle, a few cold shoulders when she returned to her old neighborhood in Atlanta to quietly visit her aunt's house. The tight-lipped silence from old colleagues when she walked past them in a downtown pharmacy and greeted them gently, only to receive stares that turned quickly away. Then came the articles, not the mainstream media, but the fringe blogs, the think pieces that raised eyebrows under the guise of fairness and objectivity. One op-ed read, "Does Aaliyah Carter deserve the praise, or did she just get lucky?" Another, "Protocol exists for a reason. Are we rewarding chaos?" The internet, as always, split in two. One half rose in defense of her courage, reposting her original Trauma Bay footage, leaked from an anonymous staffer, now viral with 70 million views, citing her raw instinct and grace under fire. The other half raised suspicious questions. Why had the president moved so fast? Was it a political stunt? Why was she the only one recognized, when many others had hesitated out of fear of consequences? Some even twisted her race into the narrative. Would a white nurse have gotten the same attention? One anonymous commenter wrote, followed by a thread of replies both vicious and vile. Aaliyah didn't respond. She never posted, never tweeted, never gave a statement. She returned home each night to her quiet, white-columned house in Arlington, lit a lavender-scented candle, and sat silently with the soft hum of city traffic in the distance. She didn't read most of the comments, but they found her anyway, sometimes in her inbox, sometimes on whispered lips in Capitol elevators, sometimes in the lingering pause before a handshake was returned. And yet, she never once allowed herself to wish for anonymity again, because she knew who she was, what she had done, and why it mattered. Still, some nights pressed heavier than others. One in particular, as thunder cracked beyond the Virginia treetops, she sat alone in her kitchen, a steaming mug of chamomile untouched beside her. On the table lay a small envelope addressed to her in looping handwriting, a letter from a 19-year-old nursing student from Oakland. It read, "Dear Ms. Carter, I saw what they said about you. I want you to know they tried to break you so they wouldn't have to see themselves. But you built something instead. You built a path for girls like me." Aaliyah's hands trembled as she folded the letter back and placed it with dozens of others just like it, stored in a shoebox beneath her bed. That night, she didn't cry. She planned. The next morning, Aaliyah scheduled a private meeting with the White House Chief of Staff. Then she called in a meeting with her legal advisor, a branding consultant, and 3 retired nurses who had quietly mentored her behind the scenes for years. Within weeks, the Carter Initiative was born, not as a nonprofit, not as a PR move, but as a fully operational fellowship program designed to embed young, underrepresented medical professionals into real-world hospital environments, while pairing them with veteran mentors who had survived the system's apathy and fought their way through burnout, bias, and bureaucracy. It wasn't flashy. There were no press releases. The logo was simple, 2 open hands surrounding a stethoscope. The mission statement was clearer. Train the brave, protect the good, heal the future. Aaliyah poured herself into the work. She visited struggling clinics in Baltimore, Detroit, Jackson, Birmingham, offering grants for better equipment, shadowing programs, and even therapy stipends for overworked trauma nurses. In one rural town in Mississippi, she quietly paid for an entire ER wing to be remodeled in memory of a nurse who had died by suicide the year before. In Chicago, she sat for hours with a group of nursing students of color who had considered dropping out after relentless microaggressions from their instructors. "I don't belong here," one whispered to her. Aaliyah looked her in the eye and said, "That's exactly why you do." But still, the murmurs didn't die. On television, talking heads questioned her influence. On social media, skeptics called her manufactured virtue. She remained silent, letting the work speak louder, and it did. One hospital reported a 20% increase in nursing school retention after joining the fellowship. Another credited the program with saving its maternity wing from closure. Lives were changing. Still, one night, in the quiet of her clinic office, Aaliyah sat staring at the dog tag on her desk, its edges worn now from countless hands. She thought of that night again, the thunder, the rain, the blood, the choice. And she whispered, not to anyone but herself, "Would I do it again?" And the answer, as always, came not in words but in truth that bloomed through her chest like fire. Yes. Even now, even with the cost, especially with the cost, because she had learned something deeper, that the truest acts of service rarely came with applause, and that sometimes, to make real change, you had to let yourself be misunderstood. And when the applause dies, when the media moves on, what remains is not the article or the spotlight, but the lives touched, the students trained, the patients healed, and the young girl watching the news from a small apartment in Memphis, dreaming for the first time that maybe, just maybe, she could matter too. That was the fire Aaliyah Carter now carried, quiet, relentless, unyielding. It was a Thursday afternoon, thick with humidity when the knock came, soft, measured, but insistent enough to break the quiet rhythm of the White House Medical Clinic's heartbeat. And though Aaliyah Carter had heard thousands of knocks in her career, urgent ones, desperate ones, impatient ones, this one felt still, as though it carried not crisis, but something heavier, memory. She looked up from her desk, where she'd been reviewing new mentorship applications, her fingers brushing the edge of the worn dog tag beside her keyboard. "Come in," she called, voice level, expecting perhaps an intern, a staffer, or another dignitary requesting a flu shot before a foreign briefing. But when the door opened, her breath caught mid-sentence. Standing there, hesitant, older, but unmistakable, was her father's old best friend, a man she hadn't seen in nearly 15 years, Dr. Randall Elkins, a former surgeon, now graying at the temples, wearing a tailored navy suit that didn't hide the fact that age had softened his jaw and deepened the lines around his eyes. Aaliyah stood slowly, confusion and recognition blending in equal measure. "Dr. Elkins?" she said, almost not believing it. "Aaliyah," he replied, his voice still warm, still low, still marked by that same southern cadence that used to echo through her childhood home during late-night medical debates with her father. She blinked, her lips parting slightly. He stepped into the room, closed the door gently behind him, and removed his glasses. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "I remember everything," she said quietly. And she did. She remembered how he used to bring her peppermint candy while her father dozed on the couch after 12-hour shifts. She remembered how he taught her to use a stethoscope when she was just 8 years old. And she remembered how, after her father passed suddenly from a heart attack during a night shift, Dr. Elkins never came to the funeral, never called, never explained. That wound, like so many others, had simply calcified into silence. Until now. She motioned to the chair across from her, and he sat. For a moment, there was only the hum of the air conditioning, the muffled sound of footfalls in the hallway, and the slow, quiet ticking of the clock above the door. "I saw you on television," he said finally. "I saw what you did. I saw the boy. I saw how you handled it all. And He stopped. Aaliyah's eyes didn't waver. "Why are you here?" she asked gently, but not without weight. He looked down, then back up, visibly struggling with something far deeper than nerves. "Because I owe you a truth," he said. "Something I should have given you a long time ago." Her heartbeat quickened, but her face remained still. "The night your father died," Elkins continued, "I was the attending. He collapsed during a transfer in the ICU. They called a code and He swallowed. "I was in the lounge. I'd had 2 glasses of wine with a board member. I wasn't supposed to be on shift, but they needed help. By the time I got there," his voice cracked, "it was too late." Aaliyah stared. The weight of that single truth, buried for over a decade, hit like a freight train, rearranging memories she'd long since fossilized into grief. "You let me believe he just died on the floor," she whispered. "You let me think no one could have saved him." "Because I couldn't bear to see you see me as the man who failed him," Elkins said, his hands shaking. "You were just a girl, and I was a coward." Silence engulfed the room, heavy, dense, sacred. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her, not with pride, not with pity, but with the raw, aching humility of a man who had finally looked in a mirror. "Now I see the woman you've become, and I knew if I didn't come now, I'd never come at all." She said nothing, only breathed, only sat in the space between fury and forgiveness, memory and now. Then she stood, walked to her window, looked out at the lawn beyond, where recruits still crossed in uniforms she had helped design. "I spent years trying to be the kind of nurse my father would have respected," she said, "and every time I doubted myself, I heard his voice. I imagined him telling me to hold the line, to put the patient first, even when systems fail." She turned back to Elkins, her voice calm, but not cold. "Now I know where that voice came from." He stood, as if expecting to be dismissed, but Aaliyah walked over to him, reached into her drawer, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A photo, aged and creased, her and her father, both in scrubs, her head barely reaching his elbow, both smiling with pride in front of the old ER wing. She handed it to Elkins. "Take this," she said, "not for guilt, for memory." He nodded slowly, the image trembling in his hands. "Thank you," he said, voice barely audible. She opened the door for him. "Tell the truth next time," she said softly, "even when it costs you." He met her gaze, and then he was gone. That night, Aaliyah sat in her office long after the clinic had closed, the halls dim, the moonlight soft on the marble floors. She didn't cry, she didn't rage. She simply breathed in the full circle of a truth that had finally come home. And as she looked once more at the dog tag on her desk, she realized that heroism wasn't born from perfect timing or recognition. It was forged in moments when no one is watching, when you choose honesty over hiding, purpose over protection. She had faced war in the trauma bay. Now she faced it in the quiet spaces too. And in both, she remained, unshaken, unbroken, and more ready than ever for what came next. The headlines had quieted, the hashtags slowed, the reporters turned to fresher drama, and yet inside the White House Medical Clinic, where the scent of antiseptic hung like a promise, and the silence was broken only by the hum of air vents and the distant click of a security officer's boots, Aaliyah Carter sat alone, behind the wide oak desk that bore her name, surrounded by framed commendations, leadership awards, and letters of gratitude she hadn't read in weeks. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because something inside her had shifted, something hard to name, but impossible to ignore, like a pressure building quietly behind the walls of a dam no one else could see. Outside, the mentorship program she built was thriving. 42 new fellows placed in hospitals across the country, 5 community clinics funded, 3 nursing students from her old Atlanta neighborhood now in full scholarships thanks to the Carter Initiative. The numbers told a story of victory. But the numbers didn't show the nights she sat at her kitchen counter in silence, the mornings she woke up dreading the weight of the badge she used to wear with pride, or the dreams, recurring now, where she stood in an endless hallway filled with locked hospital doors, each one bearing the name of a patient she'd never had time to reach. On paper, she was at the height of her power. In reality, she felt completely alone. Her days had become procedural, meetings with advisors, reviewing clinic protocols, handling security briefings for foreign diplomats, listening to senators talk about optics and branding. But the one thing she had once loved, being a nurse, being present in the quiet agony of human pain and healing, had been slowly replaced by the machinery of institutional leadership. And though she wore the title proudly, she began to wonder, was I meant to lead this building or something far outside it? That question lingered one rainy afternoon when a young EMT from Chicago, part of her second mentorship cohort, arrived early for a scheduled check-in. He was nervous, barely 24, stammering through his introduction until she offered him tea and a warm smile. "I didn't think you'd remember me," he said. You interviewed me on Zoom in February. I remember, she said softly. You wore a red hoodie and quoted Maya Angelou. He lit up, visibly relieved. They talked for 20 minutes, about his rotations, his fears, the time he'd frozen during a code blue and felt like quitting. And as she listened, really listened, she felt the crack open again. That pull toward the raw, messy realness of frontline medicine. Not strategy, not speeches, but blood, breath, and bravery. I didn't come here to be famous, he said before leaving. I came because I saw someone who made me believe I'd be safe. That sentence haunted her. That night, she stood by her bedroom window for hours, watching the storm roll in over Arlington. She didn't turn on the lights, didn't touch her phone. She just stood there, a silhouette of thought, and whispered to herself, "Am I still that someone?" The next morning, she made a quiet call to her attorney. The following week, she submitted a formal proposal, highly classified, to the White House Chief of Staff. No press release, no ceremony. Just a plan, a new direction, a recalibration of legacy. She asked to take a 6-month sabbatical, not to rest, but to return. Return to the field, to medicine, to the forgotten places where people weren't asking for medals, just mercy. She wanted to embed in underfunded ERs across the country, incognito. No title, no badge, just Aaliyah, the nurse. She would rotate through emergency rooms, clinics, rural triage units, from Louisiana bayous to tribal lands in New Mexico. She would observe, serve, document, and most of all, listen. At first, the staff pushed back. "It's dangerous," one aide said. "You're too valuable to risk it." But the president, when she finally told him directly, simply nodded. "A nurse who forgets where she came from forgets how to lead," he said. "Go, just come back." She packed lightly, wore no White House insignia, took only one photo, a picture of her father taped into her journal, and the dog tag she still carried in her pocket like a compass. When she boarded the first flight, commercial, not military, no one recognized her, and she liked it that way. Over the next 2 months, she became invisible again, and in that invisibility, she rediscovered everything. In a crumbling ER in rural Alabama, she held the hand of an elderly black man who had waited 12 hours to be seen for chest pain. In a storm-damaged clinic in Texas, she helped rig a generator to keep infant incubators alive during a power outage. In a migrant border camp, she treated sunstroke and dehydration with nothing but cotton rags and bottled water. Each time, she worked in silence. No camera, no applause. But the people, God, the people, filled her again. Their stories, their strength, their resilience. The way a child smiled even while bleeding. The way a mother held her son's head even as she screamed. One night in Mississippi, she sat outside the hospital beneath a broken light and cried harder than she had in years. Not from pain, but from something holy. Recognition. This was why she had chosen the path in the first place. Not the medals, not the policies, the hands, the heartbeats, the hope. When she finally returned to Washington at the end of the 6th month, she looked different. Not older, not wearier, but fuller. She didn't announce her arrival. She simply walked back into the clinic one morning at 7:00 a.m., slipped into her coat, and began her shift. The nurses cheered, the staff embraced her, and for the first time in a long time, Aaliyah Carter felt home not in a building, but in herself. Leadership wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing, and she had seen enough to last a lifetime. But more importantly, she was ready to lead with truth again. She waited exactly 13 days after her return to Washington before she made her move, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because Aaliyah Carter believed that revolutions didn't begin in noise. They began in stillness, and she needed time to process what she had seen, what she had touched, and what had nearly broken her during the 6 months she had gone back into the field, not as the White House's head nurse, not as a symbol, not as a media darling, but as a woman with 2 hands, 1 stethoscope, and the will to remember why she began in the first place. So when she finally called the press conference, the West Wing scrambled. Senior aides were confused. Cabinet secretaries demanded briefing notes. The president's advisors whispered behind closed doors, trying to guess what she would say, what she might reveal. Rumors exploded online. Some said she was resigning, others thought she'd been offered a cabinet-level post, and some even suggested she was writing a book. But Aaliyah said nothing. She walked silently into the East Room that morning, wearing a slate-gray suit with no insignia, her curls tied back, her face calm but electric. The room was packed, journalists shoulder to shoulder, senators murmuring in tight huddles, representatives from major hospital boards, education leaders, and seated in the front row, her father's photo framed quietly on a single chair beside the president himself. When the room stilled, she stepped to the podium and adjusted the mic, not nervously but precisely. And then she spoke. 6 months ago, she began, I stepped away from my position not because I was tired, not because I was lost, but because I needed to remember what our systems have forgotten. That healthcare in America is not built on politics. It is built on people. A murmur ran through the room. She paused, let it settle. I spent those 6 months working incognito in 15 medical facilities across 9 states. Public clinics, emergency rooms, mobile trauma units, border shelters, and rural outposts where the nearest full hospital was hours away. What I saw, she drew a breath. What I saw changed me. She described the elderly woman who had walked 6 miles to receive insulin because her Medicaid application was lost. The boy with a broken collarbone turned away because the ER was full. The nurse in Arizona who used her own paycheck to buy gauze. The doctor in Kansas who treated 4 patients while battling his own untreated cancer because he couldn't afford to stop working. The silence in the room grew dense, reverent. These are not outliers, Aaliyah continued. They are the hidden norm, and the only reason I was able to see them was because I stopped being seen. She paused, scanning the room. Her voice never wavered. And that's why I'm announcing the launch of the National Healthcare Equity and Emergency Reform Plan, or HERE, a bipartisan, boots-on-the-ground initiative to overhaul how we train, fund, and protect frontline medical workers across the United States. This isn't a proposal. It's a declaration, and it starts today. Cameras flashed wildly. One reporter gasped, but Aaliyah wasn't finished. She outlined the pillars: federal grants to rebuild rural and underserved ER infrastructure, a national licensing accelerator for nurses from marginalized backgrounds, a trauma-informed curriculum overhaul for nursing schools, mental health protections for EMTs, a new federal hotline that allowed frontline workers to anonymously report systemic abuses and request support, and, most controversially, mandatory field re-immersion for medical administrators every 5 years. No one should manage what they no longer understand, she said. Leadership is not a perch, it is a return. The president stood slowly and joined her at the podium. I've read every word of this proposal, he said, placing his hand on her shoulder. And I am signing it into executive action today. Because what Aaliyah Carter has done is not politics. It is patriotism. Applause erupted. Some reporters wept. But Aaliyah simply nodded once, stepped back from the podium, and watched as the signature was penned. Later that day, as the press swirled and debates began to erupt across every network, she returned to the clinic, not for a photo op, not to answer phones, but to hold the hand of a staff member who had just learned her mother had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Aaliyah sat with her in the break room, holding silence like it was medicine. When asked by a journalist that evening why she had chosen this moment, she replied, "Because you don't need a disaster to make a difference. You just need to see." Her office began filling with letters again, not from senators this time, but from janitors, cafeteria workers, aides, and rural nurses in towns most Americans had never heard of. And in one envelope, scrawled in barely legible handwriting, a note that read, "They told us you forgot us, but you didn't. Thank you for coming back." That night, she placed that letter beside her father's photo, beside the dog tag she still kept in the same place as always. She didn't smile, she exhaled, and in that breath was the weight of generations of silenced healers who had finally been heard. And she knew this was the real beginning. The week after the HERE initiative was signed into executive action, the country reacted like a system jarred from sleep, suddenly alert, confused, polarized. In cities from Los Angeles to Charleston, hospital staff gathered in conference rooms to watch the press conference replay. Medical students shared clips of Aaliyah's speech with teary captions, and nursing forums lit up with cautious hope. Hashtags like "She Here Now" and "Carter Reform" trending alongside testimonials from rural clinics long ignored by lawmakers. But just as the light began to flicker in the eyes of the disillusioned, the pushback arrived, sharp as a scalpel and twice as cold. It started subtly, in boardrooms where hospital executives whispered about budget reallocations and disruptive narratives. Then came the letters, open ones from major pharmaceutical lobbying arms, denouncing the mandatory re-immersion clause for administrators as unrealistic and insulting to seasoned leadership. News pundits picked it up next, slicing through sound bites with curated cynicism. "She's romanticizing field work," one anchor said flatly, "and undermining decades of medical infrastructure built by experts." A popular healthcare CEO, anonymous on background, was quoted in a national article calling the HERE initiative a dangerous precedent designed by someone too sentimental to grasp logistics. But the most vicious blow came from within. The American Medical Governance Council, a private yet influential advisory body composed of some of the most powerful hospital network leaders in the country, issued a formal vote of censure against the HERE Act, labeling it emotionally driven policy lacking fiscal foresight. The letter didn't name her, but everyone knew who it targeted. When Aaliyah read the 17-page memo, printed neatly on council letterhead, and delivered to her by courier, she didn't flinch. But later that evening, alone in her office, she stared at the line that struck deepest. Healthcare reform must be rational, not reactionary. Personal stories, while moving, should not dictate national strategy. She sat in silence, the echo of that sentence bouncing around her ribcage like a betrayal she had always known would come. Because that was the core of their fear. Not that she had failed, but that she had succeeded without their permission, that she had bypassed years of red tape, billion-dollar interests, and prestige-choked gatekeeping, and done what none of them dared to: listen to the bottom and move from the middle. For the first time since returning from her sabbatical, Aaliyah felt tired, not from the fight, but from the loneliness of fighting forward while others tried to pull her back. Still, she didn't respond publicly. Instead, she got on a plane. Over the next 10 days, she visited 5 cities that had piloted early versions of HERE. In Memphis, she watched a once crumbling ER welcome its first fully staffed night crew in 2 years. In Flagstaff, she stood beside Native American EMTs who received trauma support funding they'd been denied for decades. In rural West Virginia, she witnessed a grandmother's cancer caught in time because her granddaughter, a nursing fellow from the HERE program, insisted on running the test twice. Each stop reaffirmed her purpose. But back in Washington, the tension grew. A closed-door Senate subcommittee quietly drafted a counter-resolution aimed at stripping HERE of key provisions, including the administrator re-immersion clause and emergency clinic grants. A leaked memo revealed that 3 major healthcare lobbying firms had pledged millions to oppose future expansions. And on the day she returned from Tulsa, jet-lagged and mud-stained from visiting a field triage unit, Aaliyah walked into the West Wing and was met not by applause, but by a grim-faced aide who said, "You're being asked to appear before Congress." She nodded once. "Of course I am." The hearing was set for 10 days later, live broadcast, a joint session under the guise of oversight and fiscal review. In reality, it was an ambush. But Aaliyah didn't prep with spin doctors. She didn't hire a speechwriter. She didn't soften the truth. She wore her standard Navy suit, her ID badge, and the same simple stud earrings her mother had given her before her first shift as a nurse. And when she sat down before a long row of suited lawmakers, cameras blinking from every angle, she didn't flinch. "Ms. Carter," one senator said, narrowing his eyes, "are you aware that your reform plan has already cost hospital networks over $80 million in redistributed funding?" "I'm aware," she replied calmly. "I'm also aware that it saved 300 lives in its first 60 days. Another senator leaned forward. "You've been accused of weaponizing your personal story to push a political agenda. What do you say to that?" She held his gaze. "If caring about people is a political agenda, then every nurse in America should run for office." The room shifted. Journalists stopped typing. Even a few staffers blinked. Aaliyah continued, her voice unwavering. "The stories I carry are not props. They are evidence. The man who bled out waiting for a wheelchair. the little girl who coded while a hallway full of staff argued over coverage protocol. I carry them because they don't get to sit in rooms like this. At the end of the hearing, no vote was taken, but the country had already decided. The clip of her final words, "We can either lead with metrics or we can lead with meaning. I choose both," was viewed 17 million times in 48 hours. Public approval of the HERE initiative surged. Petitions flooded Congress. Nurses from across the nation marched in solidarity, holding up signs that read, "We are with Carter," and "Let her lead." That night, as Aaliyah sat in her office, she opened an email from a hospital janitor in Newark. It read, "They've built walls for years to keep people like you out. Thank you for walking through anyway." She exhaled slowly, placed her hand over her chest where the dog tag usually rested in her inner pocket, and smiled, not because she had won, but because she had withstood the storm without ever compromising her compass. And for the first time, she realized, they weren't trying to destroy her. They were trying to delay her, but that clock had already run out. The threats began subtly, an anonymous voicemail here, a suspicious delay in security clearance there, a suddenly lost package of crucial grant paperwork for one of the pilot clinics in New Orleans. But Aaliyah Carter recognized the pattern early because she'd spent enough time in both trauma rooms and political circles to know that when people couldn't destroy your truth, they'd try to dismantle your peace. And so, when her home security team quietly flagged a pattern of high-level surveillance inquiries into her background, and when her brother Jamal called from Atlanta in a shaken voice to say someone had been asking questions about their late father's malpractice file from 20 years ago, Aaliyah knew this wasn't about disagreement anymore. It was about intimidation, institutional self-preservation, wrapped in the thin veil of bureaucratic scrutiny. Her reforms weren't just being challenged, they were being hunted. The HERE initiative, now expanded to 18 states, had begun reshaping the landscape of emergency care. Rural hospitals were receiving federal bridge grants. Urban ERs previously gutted by privatization were reopening night shift services. Nursing students in underserved areas now had mentorship stipends. But for every clinic empowered, a corporate entity lost leverage. And those entities had resources, lawyers, media allies, and old political debts ready to be called in. The final straw came when Aaliyah received a formal notice from the Office of Executive Oversight, warning her of a pending ethics review, one based not on anything she had done wrong, but on a perceived conflict of interest due to her prior work with field clinics that now received HERE funding. The irony was bitter. She was being accused of caring too much about the places she once served. The review would be public, political, and potentially paralyzing to the progress her team had made. She had two options: fight it in the spotlight, risking a full-scale shutdown of the reform, or step down, temporarily, offering her resignation as head of the White House Medical Clinic to protect the integrity of the program until the firestorm passed. That night, she sat in the garden behind her house, the same one that bloomed with hydrangeas her aunt had planted when she moved in, and let the decision weigh on her shoulders like a memory. She thought of her father, of the trauma bay, of every nurse who had written to her, every student who whispered, "I want to be like you." And she whispered back, to no one but the stars, "Then I have to show them how." The next morning, she submitted a letter, short, unsentimental. "In the interest of preserving the mission we've fought to build, I will temporarily vacate my position. This is not surrender, this is strategy. I will not stop the work, I will only remove the target from my title." By noon, the news exploded. Aaliyah Carter steps down amid ethics review. Speculation flew, her allies panicked, critics smirked. But the country held its breath, because what happened next was something no one expected. Dr. Helen Dryden, the hospital administrator who had once fired her on the spot in Atlanta, the woman who had stood in that office years ago and said, "You're terminated," held a press conference and defended her on national television. She stood at a podium outside Grady Memorial and said, "I failed Aaliyah Carter once. I will not do it again. She saved lives long before anyone gave her a microphone. And if we punish that now, we're punishing the very thing healthcare was built for." It went viral, not because of drama, but because of truth. In that moment, one of Aaliyah's former enemies had become her fiercest shield. And behind the scenes, Helen reached out. She asked to meet. They sat in a small tea shop in D.C., tucked away from cameras, just two women with long histories and heavy shoulders. "I watched you build what I never had the courage to," Helen said. "I once believed in the system. You made me believe in the people again." Aaliyah didn't reply with grace. She replied with honesty. "You almost broke me." "I know," Helen said, "but now let me help rebuild." And she did. Over the next 2 weeks, Helen coordinated a coalition of hospital administrators who refused to honor the ethics review until it had been independently investigated. She organized op-eds, verified grant records, rallied donor support. And with each passing day, Aaliyah's temporary silence grew louder than any speech she could have made. Meanwhile, Aaliyah focused on the work, quietly advising HERE rollout teams, writing curriculum guides, responding personally to every letter from new nurses in the field. She refused interviews, refused to become the story again. And in that refusal, the story evolved. The public began to ask, why are we punishing reformers? Lawmakers began receiving tens of thousands of handwritten letters. The ethics board, under increasing pressure, fast-tracked the review. And one morning, after 62 days of absence, Aaliyah received a single email. Subject line, cleared. The body, just 2 words, come home. That night, she stood before her bathroom mirror, looking at the woman she had become. Not just a leader, not just a symbol, but a survivor of institutional retaliation, and proof that you could give up power without ever giving up purpose. And she knew, when she returned, it wouldn't be to reclaim a title. It would be to finish what she started. Not because she needed to, but because no one else would dare to the way she did. The day Aaliyah Carter returned to the White House Medical Clinic, it wasn't under the flash of cameras or behind velvet ropes. It was just after sunrise, the air still cool with spring's breath, when she stepped out of a quiet black SUV and walked up the familiar marble steps carrying nothing but her shoulder bag, her stethoscope, and the dog tag. She never stopped keeping close to her heart. There was no security escort, no grand welcome. But as she opened the front doors herself and stepped into the polished silence of the executive wing, every nurse on duty stopped mid-motion, their eyes locking on her with a reverence no ceremony could replicate. No one clapped, no one cheered. They just watched as she walked the length of the corridor and re-entered her office, the door clicking shut with a sound that felt like both punctuation and prelude. She stood there for a long time, hand resting on her desk, not because she was afraid, but because she knew what came next mattered more than anything that had come before. In the weeks since her temporary resignation, the HERE initiative had not only survived, it had thrived. Applications to the nursing mentorship program had tripled. Over 24 hospitals had voluntarily adopted the field re-immersion model for administrators, even without a mandate. And most strikingly, a group of young nurse fellows had launched an independent network called the Carter Collective, a grassroots alliance built on her principles. Their mission? Never let compassion become a casualty of compliance. Aaliyah didn't return to resume command. She returned to complete the transformation. Her first act was to restructure the leadership model inside the clinic itself. She dissolved the rigid hierarchy that had previously distanced decision-makers from caregivers and replaced it with rotating nurse-led leadership councils, where policy was shaped not by title, but by testimony. She opened the clinic's doors to regular community medical days, where civilians could walk in, free of ID or insurance, and be treated by some of the best professionals in the country. Then, without preamble, she submitted the reclamation bill to the Department of Health and Human Services, an expansion blueprint that would take the core tenets of HERE and embed them into every federally supported health program within 5 years, from tribal health networks to correctional facility clinics. It included equity audits, cultural safety training, and a clause requiring a seat on every regional healthcare board for a working frontline staff member. Not a proxy, not a figurehead, but someone who still touched patients weekly. The response from political leadership was tepid at best, but Aaliyah knew something they didn't. The hearts of the people had already shifted. Across the country, quiet revolutions bloomed. A hospital in Detroit renamed its new trauma wing after a Haitian-American nurse who had worked there for 43 years without ever holding a supervisory title. A pediatric clinic in Tulsa began treating undocumented children without asking for parental status. A field hospital in Montana used HERE grants to hire 4 midwives for its indigenous communities. and reduced maternal mortality by nearly 40% in 6 months. These weren't anecdotes, they were outcomes. And Aaliyah began compiling them, not in glossy reports, but in a living archive, accessible online to any health worker in America, where they could upload what worked, what didn't, and what they dreamed. She called it the pulse. Because, she said in a private roundtable, the system doesn't have a brain problem, it has a heart problem. Let's listen to its beat. But change, real change, has enemies. Just as the momentum swelled, several conservative lobbyists filed injunctions against the reclamation bill, attempting to freeze its rollout by citing fiscal overreach and ideological interference with healthcare neutrality. One prominent senator called her vision emotional socialism in a lab coat. But this time, Aaliyah didn't flinch. She was no longer fighting alone. Governors from 7 states wrote a joint letter supporting the bill. 2 major insurance providers, surprisingly moved by public demand, pledged matching funds to help transition struggling hospitals into HERE-aligned facilities. And perhaps most stunning of all, over 30,000 frontline health workers signed an open declaration in support of the legislation within 72 hours. She stood before Congress once more, this time with her team behind her, paramedics, janitors, aides, and young nurses, all wearing plain scrubs, no suits, no slogans. When asked if she thought she could succeed against so much institutional inertia, she said simply, "I'm not here to win. I'm here to make it impossible to go back." That night, she received a voicemail from Lance Corporal Thomas Walker, now honorably discharged and starting medical school on a veteran scholarship. "You didn't just save my life," he said. "You made me want to save others." She closed her eyes and whispered back to the quiet, "That's the point." Later, she stood again in the garden behind her home, now joined by a new addition, a single bronze plaque placed among the hydrangeas, engraved with her father's name, and beneath it the words, "She remembered." And because she did, everything changed. Aaliyah Carter hadn't returned for recognition. She had returned for reckoning, and it had come. The day Aaliyah Carter stepped away from the podium for the last time as the public face of the HERE movement, the sky above Washington, D.C., was overcast but calm, as if the world itself had paused to honor a transition that wasn't about retreat, but release. She had just finished delivering a speech, not to the press, not to Congress, but to the second graduating class of the Carter Collective, a sea of young nurses, trauma techs, and community health advocates gathered under an open-air tent on the National Mall, all wearing scrubs embroidered with their names, not her initials, because that was the point, not to raise a monument to her legacy, but to prove that her legacy had become theirs. She spoke plainly that day. No teleprompter, no applause breaks, just her voice, even and clear. "If I've done anything right, it's not building a system that centers me. It's building one that survives without me. What we've created together is not a movement of personalities. It's a movement of principles. And that means this is no longer mine to carry. It's yours now." A silence followed, not out of awkwardness but gravity, like the breath the ocean takes before a wave. Then, slowly, one by one, the graduates stood, not clapping, not cheering, but placing their right hand over their heart in silent acknowledgement, a ritual they had created among themselves called the Oath of Return, a vow not to forget where they came from once they rose. Aaliyah swallowed hard. That was more than she ever needed. That night she returned home not to a spotlight, but to stillness. Her home in Arlington was quiet now, the air filled with the scent of jasmine and freshly brewed tea. On her coffee table sat 3 things: a folded newspaper with the headline, "Carter Reform Act Signed into Law," a framed photo of her father, smiling in scrubs beside a young Aaliyah with messy curls, and a single sheet of paper, a letter from a nurse in Anchorage who had just reopened a tribal health clinic with the grant her team had helped design. "I hope you know," it ended, "we're not building what you started. We're building what you made us believe was possible." She set it down with a deep, steady breath and walked to her desk, where the dog tag still lay, scratched, worn, but whole. She didn't pocket it this time. She placed it in a velvet box, wrapped it in a blue ribbon, and addressed it to Thomas Walker with a handwritten note. "For the next chapter, pass it on when you know it's time." Then, for the first time in years, she closed her laptop and let the evening arrive without agenda. But though she stepped back from the center, the story did not end. Across the country, small revolutions continued to unfold. A nurse in Nevada testified before her city council to stop clinic closures, citing Aaliyah's blueprint as legal precedent. A rural community in Arkansas renamed their mobile trauma unit the Carter Van. And in the lobby of the White House Medical Clinic, now directed by one of Aaliyah's first mentees, a wall bore a simple engraving: "Let leadership be the art of remembering the patient." But perhaps the most profound sign came quietly. In a nursing school in Detroit, a first-year student asked her professor if the Carter model would be on the final exam. The professor smiled and said, "No, it's what you're going to live." Years later, when Aaliyah was asked during a rare interview what she hoped people remembered her for, she didn't hesitate. "Not for what I did," she said, "but for how many people believed they could do it too." And that was the truth. The hospitals no longer needed a hero. The clinics no longer needed a miracle, because the system had been shifted, not by force, but by faith, by heart, by a woman who dared to do what most feared: lead with humanity, and leave when the mission could walk without her. The headlines moved on, but the heartbeat never did. What started as a single act of defiance became a national movement. Aaliyah Carter didn't just save a life, she changed the future of healthcare for an entire generation. And she did it not by asking for permission, but by standing for what was right, even when it cost her everything. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about courage, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and tell us what moments stood out to you the most. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, real, powerful human stories, then subscribe to Flow Story and join a growing community that values purpose over noise, because the world needs more stories that heal. And together, we'll keep telling them.